Friday, December 16, 2022. Welcome to a new backcountry snowpack summary brought to you by North Shore Rescue. Last weekend we had our first real avalanche cycle on the North Shore for the season. On Saturday there was several skier trigger and natural avalanches, all soft storm slab, nothing really much bigger than size 1. And then towards the end of the storm on Sunday we had a little bit of crust forming on the surface, which probably sort of mellowed out the ambition of the Chargers. That said, however, on Sunday, the Bluebird Courage seemed to be running high, and all over the Sea to Sky area, there's some very bold decisions being made. Some of them actually led to, fortunately, only close calls, but there was at least 2 reported size 2 skier accidental avalanches in the Sky Pilot area and also in the Whistler area. And since then the weather has settled into a pretty benign pattern, and it has given time for the snow to settle a little bit. That said, with the avalanche hazard coming down a little bit and not a whole lot of new snow in the forecast, we still have quite a number of things to say about the snow and what that cold forecast and dry period means, and what's also maybe lingering still a little bit under the surface. So if you want to know more about the conditions and what's coming next week, stick around for the snowpack discussion. So this week we picked a little northwest facing feature. We're on Black Mountain, just a little bit underneath 1100 meters. And so last week we were talking about the importance of knowing what's happening underneath below the snowpack. And of course now this week I'm going to tell you that the surface is also very important, especially what's going to happen to it with the weather forecast that we have. So when we have new snow falling, 2 of the basic questions that we want to ask ourselves is, first, will the new snow stick well to the surface it's falling on? And the second is whether or not there's a weak layer deeper in the snowpack that may not be able to bear the weight of that new snow. So what we have here on our profile site, the surface is covered in reasonably large crystals of surface ore. So these crystals grow during cold, clear nights. They're essentially frost that form on the snow surface, and they're notoriously bad at holding new snow. So this typically will become a weak layer when it gets buried. Now, right underneath that surface ore, we have about 2 centimeters of snow that fell in like bits and pieces throughout the week. And underneath that, we have the crust that formed towards the end of the last storm last weekend. So there's a bit of a melt freeze crust here. It's actually quite nice in the sense that it supports the weight of a skier or a snowshoer quite well. So we're essentially just skiing on the top 2 centimeters. Now, the weather forecast is for a little dusting maybe this weekend, maybe another 2-3 centimeters, something of that nature. And then it's supposed to stay dry and get really cold. So what's going to happen here is that all that new snow is going to start to transform, and that cold temperature is going to cause those crystals to become very angular in something that we call facets. Facets typically don't bond very well together, and they're not able to hold the weight of new snow coming on top. The only thing that could make facets worse is when they're sitting on top of a crust, which is actually going to be the case here. And on top of that, we have this surface ore. So what we're expecting during this week is for the surface to deteriorate and to become worse at being able to hold new snow. Now, it's hard to tell exactly what's going to happen, whether it's going to become a persistent weak layer or not. So 2 scenarios. We get a big wet coastal dump and this gets all wet. We're probably going to have like an initial storm slab cycle on that crust, and then that's the last we're going to hear of it. Different scenario would be sort of slow incremental loading of that layer, and it becomes preserved, and now definitely has the potential of becoming a persistent weak layer that's going to plague us for a little bit longer. So that's for the story of the surface and what we expect in the coming week. Now the story of what's underneath isn't really quite over either. So we have snow that is reasonably well settled, but right here, which is about 50 centimeters down in this site, we have a layer of graupel, and they're really quite well preserved, and they're fairly large. And as graupels are not typically a persistent weak layer, they tend to eventually consolidate. The large ones tend to take a little bit longer. So when we do make compression tests on that layer, we're still actually getting results, and results that propagate across the column. So while this layer may not be super widespread everywhere, it's still definitely a source of concern, especially for pieces of terrain like this one. So what all of this means for the weekend? Well, for the weekend, not that much actually. Our avalanche hazards are reasonably modest. We're skiing or snowshoeing on a nice supportive crust. We're only expecting a little bit of extra snow on top of that. So we don't really anticipate big spikes in avalanche hazard. The tricky bit will be to keep an eye on the long range forecast. And right now they don't really agree enough to make a call as to what's going to happen. Keep an eye on that surface, see what's going to happen, and have a good idea of what's on the ground or on the surface of the snow when the next storm comes in. That's all I got for this week. Stay smart, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.